Hey guys, welcome to this session. I get a lot of questions on multiple topics, on multiple stocks, and I figured on a weekly basis, maybe we could start trying to produce and try to compile all these questions that you guys have for me. Okay. So, three questions that are probably most prominent, especially in today's market environment, is that the market has been mostly difficult and mostly sideways. And one of the laggards, despite the rally that you see in the consumer sector and the telco, for example, right, is are the banks safe? And can we start buying the banks given the huge drop in today's level, which I will show in a few slides from now? Okay. Second question that is often asked for me is how bad is the situation with Jollibee? And can I buy the B? I'll tackle that again later. And the last question you probably have for me is about the MerryMart IPO and whether you should be buying. And unfortunately, um, I'll probably be the most positive about the last question than the first two. Okay. So with regards to the Philippine banks, I have here charts of BDO, BPI, Metrobank, and Security Bank, and they all look terrible. All of them are pointing downwards. Most of them are trading at very cheap valuations. BDO at one times price to book. Metrobank at zero point 0.5, if I'm not mistaken. BPI at zero point 0.9. Security Bank at zero point 0.6, zero point 0.5. And if I show you the next tier banks and even on the lower tier banks, you have here PNB, Union Bank, China Bank, and East West, with East West probably having the biggest trouble versus all the other banks, given its large exposure to consumer loans. Okay, so maybe what we should tackle first is try to figure out how big of an impact it will happen on this COVID 19. Okay? And one of the things that I always tell people is that it's very difficult to measure provisions and how many non performing loans you will see not anytime soon. And because as the market starts to reopen, sorry, as the economy starts to reopen, and businesses start going back into the office and trying to figure out whether this new norm is something sustainable or not, then they'll find out whether they will file for bankruptcy and tell people, okay, I don't want to do business anymore. And I always like to use Calum as our situation. It's because if you ask me today, I don't think my business and Calum in general will ever go back to normal, right? So that's the reason why we decided to close the classroom and try to do this online um, education because we feel that this is the trend that everywhere else will go through. Okay, so even though there's some negative things about happening on the Philippine economy, it's not just isolated case. This is all over the world, and there are certain industries that we are very, very careful of. You have tourism, you have hotels, your airlines, you have certain property, residential. So it's all your fixed asset heavy industries. And in a country such as the Philippines, most of the industries are very traditional and rely on heavy capex to grow. This is very different from what you see in the United States, where your technology sector, especially your FANG and your big tech companies, are mostly driving the S&P 500. Here in the Philippines, it's totally different, and that's why if you notice, the rally in the stock market isn't as prominent as what you've seen in the U.S. Okay, but nonetheless, I think banks are relatively more healthy here, and another thing positive is valuations. Okay, so we'll talk about NPL and basically what this implies. Okay, um, very recently, Ben Jokno actually announced that NPLs could rise to as big as 500 billion and 550 billion to be exact. And that's almost double what current NPLs are, which is around 2 to 2.2%. Okay. Total loan portfolio for end February was around 11 trillion pesos. Okay, so roughly you have around 5% in terms of NPLs that is being forecasted for the full year of 2020. Now, is this small? Is this big? Personally, I don't think I know. I don't think anybody knows yet. And I think it's still very early to tell people that, okay, it's just going to be 500 billion for this year and next. Okay. So I stole some of these charts on the right side from CUL Financial. And if you haven't, go over that PowerPoint. I think it's very helpful for you guys to prepare. It compared obviously to what happened on the Asian financial crisis in 1997. And here you had NPLs blow from 4% to as high as 17% in 2001. And it took 5 years before the entire NPL actually hit its peak, 5 years into its peak. Okay? But the biggest difference, obviously, from back then in 1997 till today is that average lending rate is down from 18.4% to 7%. This is the average lending rate of all banks. And it's totally different, obviously, because if you're refinancing at 18%, it's tremendously much higher compared to today. But business conditions are also very different. And the reason why it's because there's zero business today. And I think it's totally different, and it's something that we don't know how big of an impact will happen. So I highly suggest that the banks, this is something to watch out for. Obviously, in the US, you've had announcements of bankruptcies. For example, like recently is the Hertz car rentals, JC Penney, and here in the Philippines, we haven't heard anything yet. All the big boys and all the conglomerates, when we look at it from top down, are all affected, regardless of you're mostly in the consumer sector or not. Everybody will get affected down the road. And we think that NPLs, especially in the third quarter, will probably likely show. So please be careful, please watch out and pay close attention because as I've shown on the charts of the banks, the market is pricing in a much dire situation versus your groceries and your consumer staples. Okay, so this is the last thing we'll talk about it for the banks. Second to the last thing for the banks is that there's a breakdown. Again, I stole this from CUL. You look at the breakdown of NPLs and the loan portfolio, and most of them are still in corporate loans, excluding East West. And that's why East West is more of a concern because when you talk about consumer loans, and utang ng mga tao, you have your automobiles, credit cards, and these are things that are usually at most risk in terms of refinancing. Okay? And provisions already have been done in the first quarter. I don't know whether this is big and sufficient enough for 2020. So Security Bank had the largest at 5.7 billion, Metro Bank at 5, BDO at 2, BPI at 4 billion. So we'll see. I think it's still a wait and see environment, trying to figure out how much of an impact will happen on your loan portfolio. And I think it's still very early to tell people whether this is the safest thing to start buying these companies because they're trading at very, very cheap valuations. I mean, everything is trading at record lows in terms of standard deviation, in terms of average PE. Lahat naman mura eh. Pero yung problema mo is that these things can last for significantly long periods of time. I think be patient with the banks. It's not a priority personally. I think there are other sectors to focus on, especially the telcos and the consumer staples. But we don't have an overly optimistic view on the market in general. I'm just showing that if there's one thing that you have to watch out is to watch out for the banks. Okay, so that's for the banks. Second question is about Jollibee. And if you thought 2019 was a bad year, I do not know how to describe 2020. At the market cap today of Jollibee is roughly 147 billion pesos. And the peak at 330 bucks was 360 billion in market cap. So over the last year alone, Jollibee lost 210, 220 billion in value. Okay. And rightfully so. Last year was a terrible year for Jollibee because everybody knows about the recent acquisitions with Smashburger and Coffee Bean. Um, fourth quarter of 2019 was the first quarter that Jollibee registered its performance in Coffee Bean. So going to 2020, our expectations were actually much lower, meaning we expected Jollibee to get hit tremendously in 2020 and have its lowest year. This was pre-COVID, and now you have COVID happening. I don't know how to describe 2020. Okay, revenues for fiscal year 2019 was around 180 billion pesos. So give or take, let's say dining recovers at third quarter of this year. Takeout is still there. Um, what are you looking at? 50% of revenues. So I don't know what type of revenue outlook will happen. We have to watch carefully what first quarter and second quarter in terms of sales will look like. But I expect to be hit tremendously for Jollibee. And for me, that's not the worst part because the worst part is because of the recent acquisitions and all the inefficiencies. Operating margins are at 2.87% in 2019. I repeat, 2.87%. So the room for error went from small to basically minuscule. And a room for error of 3% is so small in terms of, especially in this market condition. So I don't know what type of losses you'll probably be expecting for Jollibee for 2020. Give or take, this 5 billion in operating income is gone for 2020 and probably even more. I think the restaurant industry will probably see more layoffs, and I think it's inevitable. So hopefully things recover soon, and basically we can try to fit people get back into the restaurants as soon as possible. With regards to acquisitions, I expect the write-offs to come. I don't know personally, but they should. The positive thing is, over the last 3 years, it has cash flow for the company has been relatively healthy, among 20 billion in cash flow for the past 3 years. Um, this excludes the 12 billion depreciation that it occurs pretty much every single year. So we will see. I think Jollibee is not on the brink of bankruptcy. I just think that the impact, especially with how prices are performing today, the market cap is still very high at 147 billion. You'll probably see more store closures, layoffs, and probably more downsizing in terms of stores. So I don't think the worst is priced in, but I don't think it will go bankrupt. So please be patient with Jollibee. I think it needs more time. So I showed here the chart sa lahat ng acquisitions ng Jollibee over the past few years. This is roughly 245 million for Smash and 350 million for Coffee Bean, which totals approximately 590 to 600 million dollars in total acquisitions. That's 30 billion pesos that Jollibee has to take into consideration. So we'll see. We'll see. Okay. And obviously, the last question is people have been asking me is, do I buy MerryMart? I don't know what to say. Um, I'm not on a fundamental basis. I'm obviously not positive. Um, Basically, injected at 5 cents in terms of par value. So I think 250 to 300 million pesos. And overnight, he becomes a 6 billion value overnight. And I don't like it, right? MetroMart is being valued at 7.6 billion for four stores. Okay, for four stores. And again, very similar to what happened to Double Dragon. It's that it's selling its story, it's selling its dream. And one day they'll have 1,200 stores on all formats, supermarkets, convenience stores, and everything by 2030. Obviously, Double Dragon didn't hit its target. I don't think MerryMart will hit its target either. But maybe it's banking on the grocery side to sell this entire story, which probably makes sense in this environment. But I mean, just to give you guys an example, Metro Gaisano is 5.5 billion pesos value for 57 stores, and it also has 2.5 billion cash today. So there's nothing I can say positively about MerryMart. But one thing I can tell you guys is that usually fundamentals don't matter on the first day. Okay. So last but not the least, and why I'm positive in the first few days of MerryMart, it's because the IPO and the formula for successful IPOs has been very simple. Most of these guys in recent, especially in last year, have been expensive, and usually the secret is just to have a small size and a interesting story, which MerryMart has today. So it's only 1.5 billion that they're raising, and they have a sexy story, and most likely, I think it's worth participating on the first day. Okay. Frutas, even though it was flattish on its first day, it still went up by 45% on its high for the first day. Very similar to KPPI, where it went ceiling. It was trading at 25 times at its IPO price, but it still went ceiling for 2 or 3 days. Okay. Axolum was relatively large. It raised around 5.6 billion. I didn't like it. All home, it was priced in cheap, but the problem is the size was just too big at 15 billion pesos. So I think may laban naman ang MerryMart. Just keep your expectations in check and be really, really quick about it. I think LSI is available, so use that as your avenue for getting shares in MerryMart if you plan to avail. Okay? So thanks again, guys. I appreciate it. Hope all of you are doing well. And yeah, so just to summarize, the banks, wait and see. Jollibee, I think there's more to come in terms of bad news. And MerryMart, I think it's worth participating in the first day or first few days if there's a setup that comes along. Okay. Good luck, guys. Wish you all the best, and I'll see you soon.